Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank all of you for being here today. My brief today is to speak for a few minutes about the changing nature of contemporary armed violence and to draw out some of the implications of this for policymakers, for parliamentarians, and for analysts around the world. My scope is going to be global. I will not concentrate only on the challenges and changes that face the OSCE region, because there are many global challenges, such as the current violent clashes in Syria and Iraq, that have the potential to affect all of us in one way or another. And some of the things that I will refer to do have, of course, direct implications to, or are directly relevant to the OSCE region. So I want to put this in a larger perspective and see what has changed and perhaps what has not changed in the nature of violence, insecurity, and war today. I have 5 points that I will present fairly briefly and a bit provocatively, and maybe we can deepen the analysis in the discussion. My first point is going to concern the changing nature of war itself and what the overall global burden of armed violence and insecurity actually is. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how the sharp divide that we used to make between formal and organized armed conflict and disorganized and informal conflict is become increasingly blurry, and that this challenges our ways of thinking about violence and insecurity, and also challenges our policy instruments to deal with it. The second point I want to make is that certain kinds of violence might be declining, and there are many people who are optimistic about the decline in warfare. But this is only happening in some places, under some circumstances, and other newer forms of violence and insecurity might actually be increasing and pose real challenges to safety, security, and well-being. My third point is going to focus on new actors, so-called non-state armed groups, and how they play a role in this new forms of violence, not just separate from the state, but often working with or being part of the state. I'm going to give some interesting examples of that. My fourth point deals with the instruments of armed violence, small arms and light weapons that are used widely, universally in conflicts around the world, including, in many cases, advanced and very sophisticated weapons that are more widely available than at any time in the past, meaning that there's more lethal means in the hands of more people around the world. And finally, I'm going to say a few words about building effective and accountable institutions to provide security and safety between and within states in order to provide security, justice, and representation to all people, and how that will perhaps be an important contribution to dealing with the new forms of violence. But taken together, these points will raise a complex question that I think analysts and policymakers have not yet answered, which is, are we facing the advent of a more insecure and unsafe world with the proliferation of weapons, proliferation of armed groups, and proliferations of new forms of conflict? Or is the world slowly and over time becoming safer with war and armed conflict diminishing over the long run? I perhaps cannot answer these questions, but I can give some guidance to how to think about them. So let me start with my first point, which is about the shifting nature of contemporary violence. Most people, including military people, would argue that war, as we thought of it in the 19th and 20th centuries, no longer exists. At least if we think of war as a battle between men and machinery, the massive deciding event in international affairs fought between states. Such kinds of wars no longer exist. And modern battle is more about things such as asymmetric warfare between highly unbalanced kinds of groups, or what some strategists call operations other than war, or low-intensity conflict, or insurgency and counterinsurgency. And the kinds of military engagements that we see state armies involved in are radically different than they were in the 19th and 20th century, and they are going to remain so. This means, of course, that we have to rethink what armies do and how they provide security or create insecurity or fail to deal with conflict in different parts of the world. From a numerical point of view, the optimists have evidence on their side of a strong decline and steady decline in the number of wars. The Uppsala Conflict Data Project, for example, helpfully reassures us that the number of wars has declined to around 30 or so active conflicts in 2013. This is well below the peak of more than 50 in the early 1990s, and there are only 7 relatively large-scale wars with more than 1,000 battle deaths in places, of course, which would be familiar to all of us, such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, Syria, Iraq, and South Sudan. This is from 2013, of course. The situation is somewhat worse than in the last few years, but in a long-term perspective, there's been a steady decline since the end of the Cold War and a near total disappearance of wars between states. The vast majority of the 30 or so armed conflicts that are ongoing around the world today are small scale, a few hundred or a few dozen casualties. They're internal or civil conflicts. They involve one or more non-state armed groups. Now, this is good news for the people who believe that conflict is declining and war is disappearing. It's also true that the number of victims of war has been declining. The low estimates put it at around 50,000 people who die each year in armed conflict. I want you to remember that number for a couple of minutes. And gone are the massive wars, such as those which took place in Indochina in the 1960s and 1970s, or the post-independent wars in Africa in places such as Angola and Mozambique. These wars took hundreds of thousands of lives, or the conflict in Iran and Iraq in the 1980s, or the civil wars in Central America in the 1980s, or even the relatively large conflict in Southeast Europe after the end of the Cold War. These have ended. So it is true that the number of intensely violent conflicts has declined. It's also true that war between states has almost disappeared from the picture. And it's also true that most contemporary conflicts are relatively small scale in terms of the number of direct victims. These are all reasons to be optimistic. But I want to look a little bit more closely at this picture and ask what is missing and what are some of the issues that pose new and more difficult challenges. Generally speaking, when people talk about war, what they mean is a violent confrontation between two groups that have clearly articulated political goals, and that force is wielded by recognizable actors, unitary actors, armed forces and organized armies that have a clear command structure, they control territory, and they have straightforward and clearly presented goals. These kinds of wars were relatively easy to resolve, at least on the battlefield and in the negotiation table. But when we focus only on war in that way, we ignore such things as intertribal and clan conflicts in places such as Yemen. This does not count as a war, but roughly 4,000 people die each year, according to the Yemeni government, in what are called land disputes, often large-scale clashes. These are not individual acts of violence. They're highly organized. They claim lots of victims, and they weaken the Yemeni state. They demonstrate its inability to provide security and justice. They make the Arabian Peninsula a zone of insecurity in which other forms of violent extremism can take root. Another example of something that is left out of our picture would be such things as post-election violence, which we witness in different places around the world. One prominent example would have been the violence in Kenya, 2008, that killed more than 1,000 lives. This did not count as a war, even though it was clearly linked to loosely organized groups, some of which were linked to political parties and political elites. And these were not spontaneous or individual acts of violence. There are dozens of other examples of this kind of loosely organized, non-war violence including in places such as the favelas in Brazil, the drug wars in Mexico, unrest in parts of Asia and elsewhere. When we take this kind of picture and ask ourselves how many people actually die violently around the world, we get a very different view than if we ask how many people die in war. I said a couple minutes ago that roughly 50,000 people die in battle each year. Here I'm going to draw upon a volume of work that I've been involved with called The Global Burden of Armed Violence. We estimate that more than 500,000 people die violently on average each year. Only about 10% of these people die in armed conflicts. The overwhelming majority of victims of violence die in so-called non-war settings. Now, it is true that some of the most violent countries on the planet, if you measure this by deaths per 100,000, are in war zones, places such as Syria or South Sudan or Afghanistan. But there are many more violent places, such as Honduras or Venezuela or El Salvador, all of which are actually more dangerous than Afghanistan today. Colombia, Jamaica, Guatemala, South Africa are all more dangerous than places such as South Sudan. There are 30 countries around the world that have death rates above 10 per 100,000. Most of Western and Eastern Europe, violent death rates are around 1 or 2 or 3 per 100,000. And conventional accounts of violence and conflict and war tend to miss this kind of everyday, ongoing, and fairly large-scale insecurity that can have large economic, human, social, and political consequences. We can see this in places such as Mexico, where criminal groups are conducting military-style operations and actually recruiting members from former armed forces personnel. They engage in large-scale battles, and more than 40,000 people have died in Mexico's drug wars since 2009. This is not an example that we wish to see spread in other parts of the world where there is large-scale organized criminal activity or drug trafficking. And these in-between categories, such as urban armed violence, which is both political and criminal, or paramilitary violence, which is criminal but often sanctioned or authorized by the state, or violence by the state itself, or terrorism, all of these things show that a neat divide between criminal violence and political violence, or between economic conflict and ideological conflict, that these neat divides are no longer sustainable. So the three key points here are that most of the violence around the world today does not occur in war zones. Most of the people and states worst affected by violence are not at war, and the levels of violence in so-called non-conflict settings are often higher than in most war zones. Most of our policy responses to these kinds of forms of insecurity are not adequate. Tools such as mediation and conflict resolution, peacekeeping and post-conflict peace building, or even more robust, forceful intervention in zones of insecurity have proven to have great limits. What can modern armies do against urban terrorists and gangs? What can they do against diffuse networks conducting hit-and-run attacks against civilians, such as Boko Haram in Nigeria? Let me turn very briefly to my last couple of points. First one concerns the actual nature of the actors, the so-called non-state armed groups involved in most contemporary forms of insecurity. There are three things that we need to understand about these groups. The first is that they have different motivations than traditional armed forces. Many of them mix economic and predatory rent-seeking behavior with ideological or grievance-based claims. This includes such things as the warlords in West Africa, the vigilantes in Nigeria, the armed Janjaweed in Sudan, or even the FARC in Colombia and elsewhere. In simple terms, most people argue that today's armed groups are driven primarily by greed and are not pursuing political agendas at all. They're trying to capture natural resources or control trafficking routes or be engaged in illicit trade in drugs or trafficking in individuals. focusing on minerals and timber and things such as that. This might not be a new phenomenon, but it's very widespread today, and it has huge economic and political consequences. Extortion and criminal activity is a tax on economic well-being. It dampens international trade and local trade. It dampens investment by people in their communities, and it has measurable economic consequences. These armed groups are also not organized as traditional military actors. There are often significant divisions among the leadership over goals and tactics that often lead to splintering and division when they come to negotiate. There can be divisions between the leadership and the followers that can lead to strategic incoherence, unclear what the group is trying to achieve. And there can be divisions among different groups of combatants in the field that can produce kind of tactical incoherence. They're pursuing their own local goals that are not part of a broader vision. It's hard to negotiate with these kind of groups. You can call the leadership, but you cannot guarantee that the messages that are conveyed or the deals that are struck work their way down to the rank and file. And this makes mediations, ceasefires, and even striking a peace extremely difficult. These groups also relate to the state in different ways. They're not actually non-state actors. They're often supported by external states, a new form of intervention in each other's affairs. They often have their origins in state-sponsored militias or self-defense groups, such as paramilitary organizations. Or they found themselves supported by local political elites or politicians at the regional and national level who are engaged in violent struggles to seize power. Now, these kind of activities by non-state groups have real-world implications for strategies of engagement, including how we negotiate with them, whether or not such groups are restrained in their use of violence, whether they will respect such things as the Geneva Conventions or any kinds of civilian protection, and how we deal with them in post-conflict situations. Can we put sanctions on them? Can they be prosecuted criminally? How do we disarm and demobilize combatants after the fighting ends? Often, in many cases, the fighters engaged have no other skills than violence. And we don't know how to tackle large-scale violent and criminal gangs that have close ties to political elites. Let me say a few words now about the instruments of violence that are in the hands of these groups. Small arms and light weapons are more widely available than at any time in the past. As research by the Small Arms Survey has pointed out, there's about 990 million small arms and light weapons around the world today. Around 2/3 of these are in the hands of civilians. They're not held by state armies or national police or other groups. And in terms of ordinary lethal force, the state's monopoly of violence is a fiction, a legal fiction at least, not a practical one. One useful way of thinking about this is to look at such things as the average price of military-style weapons such as the AK-47 around the world. Prices are relatively low in conflict zones such as Africa. Prices are relatively high in Western Europe and Eastern Europe. This does not only concern unsophisticated small arms and individual weapons, but such things as advanced man-portable air defense systems that pose a threat to civilian as well as military aviation. Given the rapid collapse of such things as the Iraqi army in the face of the Islamic State onslaught and the massive quantities of weapons that have fallen into their hands, we should question the wisdom of supplying advanced weapons to volatile regions, whether it's North Africa, Southern Asia, or the Middle East. And this spread of large quantities of military-style weapons has overturned the balance between force and negotiation in many places and increased the destructiveness of conflicts when they broke out. This has direct practical and policy implications, and this involves how we deal with minimizing the access of groups to weapons, making sure that there's adequate physical security and stockpile management, and how we mop up the surplus of weapons that exist around the world. Let me conclude by saying a couple of things about institutions, and these will be my last points. One of the main functions of the modern state is to provide security to its citizens from external threats through national defense and from internal threats through the police and justice system, designed to provide public order and safety and ensure peaceful means of resolving conflicts. In many cases, the failure of the state to fulfill these functions is at the heart of the violence. Groups take up arms because there's no way to stop them. And this is true in large parts of sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, and I think can also be true, if we are not careful, in a sort of epidemic fashion spreading to other parts of the world, including our own regions. The lessons for policy are many, and I've only highlighted a few above in the last couple minutes. But in simple terms, strategies for ending conflicts and insecurity have to focus on building effective and accountable institutions that help to make sure the state's monopoly on violence is a reality and ensure that this monopoly is not abused. Thank you.